She had been watching him for 3 days before he ever laid eyes on her. She had his patrol patterns memorized, the times he circled Birchwood Drive, the blocks he slowed on without a dispatch call, the particular way he parked his cruiser at an angle that let him watch the sidewalk without appearing to. She had his complaint file open on her laptop every morning before her coffee finished brewing. 22 buried complaints, 18 years on the force. 0 formal discipline. She knew the name of his captain, the name of the captain's golf partner, and the name of the HOA's annual donation check. She had been building the architecture of this case for 72 hours, with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who has done this work long enough to know that the worst men always reveal themselves completely. You just have to be willing to wait. She had not expected to become the evidence herself. Not this fast, but here she was, standing on a public sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon in October, holding a thermos of coffee, watching the elm trees drop their leaves one by one onto the hood of a white Mercedes, parked at the curb, and waiting for the school bell at Whitmore Academy to ring, so her 9-year-old son could walk through those iron gates and see her face first, the way he always did, the way she had promised him she always would. Riverdale Heights was the kind of neighborhood that wore its wealth like a second skin, so accustomed to the comfort of money that it no longer thought about it, just lived inside it. The way a person lives inside a house they've owned so long, they've stopped seeing the walls. The lawns were the color of professional sports fields. The hedgerows were trimmed to uniform height. The sidewalks were so clean they almost looked painted, and the imported sedans parked along the curb gleamed in the October light, like a row of quiet, expensive declarations. We belong here, and we have always belonged here. Naomi Pierce was 36 years old, and she was standing on that sidewalk in a navy peacoat and sensible boots holding a thermos. And she was not thinking about the sedans or the hedgerows or the particular quality of wealth that surrounded her. She was thinking about Marcus. He was 9. He had a brain that still sometimes astonished her, not with its speed, though it was fast, but with its depth, the way he sat with a problem long after other children had moved on and turned it over and over, until he understood not just the answer, but the shape of the question. He had won a full academic scholarship to Whitmore's advanced STEM program 8 months ago, the youngest recipient in 11 years. He was currently in the final 20 minutes of his after-school robotics club, where he had spent the last 3 weeks building a suspension bridge model from balsa wood and steel wire. He had explained the load distribution principles to Naomi on 3 separate occasions. She had listened every single time as though it were the first, because the way his face looked when he talked about load distribution was one of the best things she had ever seen in her life. She drove a 12-year-old Nissan Sentra. It had a dent above the rear left wheel well and a cracked dashboard panel covered with electrical tape. It was parked legally at the curb, 40 feet from where she stood, right behind the white Mercedes. And the contrast, if someone chose to see it as a contrast, rather than simply 2 cars on a public street, said everything about whoever was choosing to see it, and nothing at all about Naomi Pierce. She drove the Nissan because every surplus dollar she had went into a college fund with Marcus's name on it. She had been doing that for 6 years, and she intended to do it for 9 more. She checked her phone. 3:09 p.m. 21 minutes. She took a slow sip of coffee, watched a leaf spiral down through the still afternoon air, and did not notice the cruiser until it was almost on top of her. 3 days earlier, Naomi had pulled Wade Burrell's file from the DOJ database and read it start to finish in a single sitting. What she found was not a monster. That was the thing that always surprised people who hadn't done this work. The worst ones were rarely monsters. They were men who had been given a very small amount of power and had organized their entire personality around protecting it. Men who had found an institution that would reward their cruelty if they dressed it in the right language. Men who had been allowed to operate without consequence for long enough that impunity had stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like a right. Wade Burrell was 47 years old and had been driving the Riverdale Heights beat for 11 of his 18 years on the Harwick County Police Department. He was thick through the shoulders perpetually, a week past his last haircut, with a jaw that looked as though it had been clenched since roughly 1997. His uniform was always slightly wrinkled. His boots were scuffed at the toe. The officers at his union hall had a nickname for him that he had not been given. He had chosen it himself and promoted it until it stuck. They called him the Hammer. He had built his professional identity around that word the way other men build identities around their children or their faith. He had 22 complaints buried in his personnel file placed there over 18 years by Captain Vince Hartley, who had been the commanding officer of the 4th Precinct for 7 years, and who understood with the pragmatic clarity of a man who had learned early that survival required selective blindness, which battles cost money, and which ones didn't. The Riverdale Heights Homeowners Association donated $40,000 annually to the Police Benevolent Fund. Hartley attended their gala every year. He accepted the checks. He filed the complaints in a desk drawer that he locked every evening before he went home. Naomi had known all of this before she ever set foot in Riverdale Heights. She had known it from the DOJ briefing packet, from the complaint records she had subpoenaed in advance from the financial records of the Benevolent Fund. She had arrived 3 days ago and spent those days in plain clothes, observing Burrell's patrol patterns, watching how he moved through the neighborhood, watching who he stopped and who he passed, and what the difference was between them. She had not shown her federal credentials to anyone in the city. She had left her DOJ identification in the inside breast pocket of her peacoat specifically so she could see with her own eyes and on her own body how this precinct treated ordinary black people before she revealed who she was. She had expected to gather another week of observation. She had not expected Burrell to find her first. In Cruiser 409, he slowed the vehicle with that particular quality of deliberate deceleration that Naomi recognized from 40 feet away, the slowing that was not caution, but selection. In the passenger seat, Officer Joel Sims, 24 years old and 6 months out of the academy, felt the shift in the car's speed and the familiar low-grade dread that had been living in his chest since his first week on Burrell's route settle into something more acute. Check this out. Burrell's voice was a flat, casual drawl, the tone of a man who had already made a decision and was narrating it rather than considering it. Sims looked through the windshield. A woman in a navy coat standing at the sidewalk outside Whitmore Academy, holding a thermos. "She's just standing there," he said. "School gets out in 20 minutes. Not in this neighborhood, she's not." Burrell's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. His eyes tracked her car, the Nissan behind the Mercedes, then came back to her face. "Look at that car. Look at her. People who live here don't stand on public sidewalks with a thermos, Joel. They're inside. They have places to be. Burrell, she's literally just watch and learn kid." He hit the flashing lights without the siren, just the strobing red and blue aimed like an accusation at a woman holding a cup of coffee, and pulled the cruiser to the curb with a sharp scrape of tires on concrete that was itself a kind of statement. The lights hit the sidewalk, and Naomi felt the sensation she had felt so many times in her life that she had stopped calling it fear and started calling it information. Her body knew what was happening before her mind had finished processing it. She set her shoulders. She kept her thermos visible with both hands wrapped around it. She did not step back, did not step forward, did not move her feet at all. She watched Burrell get out of the cruiser. She watched him adjust his belt, a slow, deliberate performance of authority that served no functional purpose and communicated everything. He planted his feet wide when he stopped in front of her, the stance of a man who believed the ground belonged to him. Sims came around the back of the car and stopped several feet behind his training officer, already looking like a person who has realized they are in the wrong place and doesn't know how to leave. "Afternoon." The word came out stripped of every social obligation it normally carried. It wasn't a greeting. It was a designation. "Good afternoon, officer." Naomi's voice was warm enough to be civil and level enough to be unmistakable. She met his eyes directly. "Is there a problem?" Burrell did what she had watched him do 18 times in 3 days of observation. He looked at her slowly, facecoat hands car, cataloging her the way a man catalogs an object he is deciding whether to keep or discard. He didn't answer her question. He asked his own. "What exactly are you doing out here?" "Waiting for my son." She said it simply without elaboration. She did not owe him her son's scholarship or her job title or a single word beyond what he had asked for. "He finishes his robotics club at the academy at 3:30. I'm early." Burrell's lip moved in something that stopped just short of a smirk. His eyes went to the iron gates of Whitmore Academy, imposing, expensive, covered in the school crest, and then to her Nissan, and then back to her face. "Your son goes to Whitmore." "That's correct." "Right." The word carried 18 years of practiced condescension. "And I'm the president of the county. Look, we've been getting reports of suspicious activity in this area. Package thefts, unfamiliar vehicles. Can't have people just standing around." "I'm not standing around," Naomi said. "I'm waiting for my child on a public right-of-way." Burrell stepped closer. She smelled stale coffee and menthol cigarettes. He lowered his voice to the register he used when he wanted to make something feel like a warning. "You know what I've noticed? Smart women always have a speech ready. Legal, this right-of-way, that. You know what that tells me? That tells me you've been through this before." Naomi looked at him steadily. She had known from the moment he hit those lights that this was not a conversation. It was a performance. And she had understood something else. Every word he said was going through the dashcam's audio. Every word. "I've been through most things before," she said. "That doesn't make them legal." He stepped closer still until she could see the thread count of his collar, the faint tobacco stain on his front pocket, and she understood from the way he moved that the conversation had already ended for him, and what came next would not be a conversation. "Give me your ID. Now." "Am I suspected of committing a crime?" "I said give me your ID. In this state," Naomi said clearly enough for Sims to hear every syllable, "an officer cannot demand identification from a pedestrian without reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. Standing on a public sidewalk is not criminal activity. So no. I respectfully decline." Sims shifted his weight. "Burrell, maybe." "Shut it." Burrell didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi with the focused, flat quality of a man who had been challenged, and for whom that was the only thing that mattered now. "You think you're clever." "I think I'm a mother waiting for her son," Naomi said. "I have 14 minutes. 14 minutes. She had 14 minutes before Marcus came through those gates, and she was not going anywhere. Burrell gave her the order to leave. She refused it without raising her voice. He gave it again. She said it was not a lawful order, and that he was welcome to demonstrate otherwise. Across the street she heard the sound of a porch door opening. Patricia Elwood, though she didn't know the name yet, stepping out in a barn jacket with crossed arms and the small, satisfied expression of a woman who has just received a delivery, she ordered. 3 blocks away, without Naomi knowing it, a text had arrived on Burrell's personal phone at 3:03 p.m. 9 minutes before he hit his lights. A photograph of a woman in a navy coat standing outside Whitmore Academy. The message below it: "Woman outside Whitmore. Been there 20 minutes. Doesn't belong here. Take care of it." He hadn't needed the photograph. He'd already seen her. But it was good to know the payment was coming. "Ma'am." His voice dropped into the register he used as a final notice. "I am issuing you a lawful order to disperse. You will get in your vehicle and leave this sidewalk, or I will arrest you for loitering and failure to comply." "It is not a lawful order," Naomi said, and she said it not to him, but to the dash cam, to the record, to the moment that was already composing itself into testimony. It requires a legal basis. You don't have one. She saw the color rise in his neck. She saw his hand go to his belt. She saw Sims take a half step forward and stop conscience and cowardice meeting in his chest, and cowardice winning the way it had been winning for 6 months. Burrell looked at her for one more second. Then he reached forward and grabbed her arm. His grip was not the grip of a man making an arrest. It was the grip of a man making a point. The force of it pulled her sideways, and the thermos slipped from her hands. It hit the pavement, and the lid cracked, and the coffee spread across the pristine Riverdale Heights sidewalk in a wide, dark arc, and the sound of ceramic on concrete was sharp and wrong, and too loud for a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of sound that makes heads turn. "Let go of me." Naomi's voice changed for the first time. Not a scream, not a plea, just a single note of genuine alarm at the sudden physical reality of it. "Stop resisting." Burrell said it, overlapping with her words, layering his voice over hers, deploying the formula. "Stop resisting. Stop resisting." He twisted her arm behind her back and forced her forward at the waist. Across the street, a teenage boy in a track uniform had already pulled out his phone. She wasn't doing anything. He called out, his voice cracking with the particular moral clarity of youth. She was just standing there. "Back off, kid." Burrell didn't look at him. He had Naomi's arm wrenched behind her, at an angle that put her shoulder at the edge of its range. "This is police business." Sims stepped forward, hands raised. "Burrell, ease up, man. We have no cause here. We cannot. Secure the perimeter. Final. Flat." The voice that had ended arguments for 18 years. Sims went still. His hands dropped. And from the porch across the street, Elwood's voice carried clean and satisfied through the autumn air. "Good job, officers. Keep our streets safe," Officer Naomi said, through the pain in her shoulder, keeping her voice as controlled as she could make it. "You are hyperextending my shoulder joint. I am not resisting. I am standing still. What you are doing has a federal name." Burrell unclipped his handcuffs. The first cuff closed around her right wrist with a ratcheting click that was too loud for the stillness of the neighborhood, and she felt the steel bite into her skin tighter than it needed to be, tighter than procedure required, tight enough to send a message, and the message was, "I can." "Derek." Sims's voice was low and desperate, and almost unrecognizable from the voice he'd used at the academy. "Think about what we're charging her with. We haven't articulated a single crime. Loitering, failure to comply. I'll figure out the rest at the station." Burrell looked at his rookie with flat, absolute authority. "Left hand. Now. Or I'm writing you up." Sims reached for her left arm with hands that were not steady. Naomi turned her head and looked at him, not with pleading, not with anger, with something far more corrosive, a clear, unhurried disappointment that asked without words whether he understood what he was about to participate in, and whether he would have to live in the shape of it for the rest of his life. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away. He brought her arm back. The second cuff closed. Burrell stepped back and surveyed his work with the brief satisfaction of a man who believes he has restored order. "Let's see how smart you are in a holding cell." And then the academy doors opened. They had let the robotics club out 90 seconds early. The heavy oak doors swung wide and children in green blazers poured down the front steps. Backpacks, bouncing voices overlapping, and among them his blazer slightly too long in the sleeves. A navy backpack over one shoulder, holding something carefully in both arms, was Marcus Pierce. He looked up from what he was carrying and scanned the sidewalk for his mother's face with the complete automatic trust of a child who has never had reason to believe she wouldn't be there. He found her. He saw the flashing lights. He saw the two men in uniform. He saw the silver cuffs glinting in the October sun. The bridge model slipped from his hands. 3 weeks of careful, patient work. The load distribution calculations, the cable tensions. He had explained to his mother 3 times the balsa wood and steel wire that had finally been coming together, hit the sidewalk and broke. Balsa snapping wire, pinging loose the delicate structure of a 9-year-old's best work, coming apart in a single careless second. Mom, his voice. Small. Terrified. And underneath the terror so fully certain of her, that it broke something open in Naomi's chest that she spent the next 6 months learning to close. Marcus. She found her voice from somewhere beneath the pain in her shoulder, and the cold steel on her wrists, and the shame of standing in handcuffs on a public sidewalk in front of her son. She found it, and she made it steady. Stay right there, baby. Don't come closer. I'm okay. Stay where you are. He started running. The science teacher, Mr. Harrison, bearded mid-50s, who had watched through the window with growing horror for the past 60 seconds, came jogging down the steps and caught Marcus by the shoulders, holding him back, while the boy cried with the specific devastating quality of a child who is too old to fully cry in public and too young to stop. Officers, Harrison said, his voice barely controlled. This is Mrs. Pierce. She is one of our parents. Her son is standing right here. What on earth is happening? Take the kid inside, Burrell said. His mother is being detained. Mr. Harrison. Naomi's voice had changed register again. Not the alarm, not the composure, but something that was both at once the voice of a woman who is simultaneously a federal investigator and a mother watching her child cry, and is keeping those two things in their separate compartments by sheer force of will. Please take Marcus inside. Call my brother Dominic. His number is in Marcus's emergency contacts. Tell him to come to the 4th precinct. She held the teacher's eyes. Tell him to come right now. Harrison nodded and knelt down to Marcus's level, wrapping one arm around the shaking boy, talking to him quietly. Marcus looked over the teacher's shoulder at his mother, at her cuffed hands, at Burrell's hand on her arm, and his face was a 9-year-old's face that had just learned something about the world it was not old enough to have to know. Burrell steered her toward the cruiser. She let him. She was cataloging everything. As he pushed her down into the back seat and swung the door shut, she said loudly, clearly through the closing gap, Remember every word, Officer Burrell, every single one. You are going to repeat them under oath. He laughed. A short, hard sound. The laugh of a man who had never once been asked to repeat anything under oath, and expected that to continue indefinitely. The door slammed. The lock engaged. Inside the car, it smelled of old vinyl and industrial cleaner, and the accumulated sourness of years of people who had been frightened in that seat. Naomi sat with her hands behind her back and breathed and began her list. Burrell talked for the first 10 minutes of the 15-minute drive. He talked to her reflection in the rearview mirror, the way men talk when they believe the person listening cannot respond in any meaningful way. He told her that people like her always had a speech ready. He told her that calm and polite was just a different kind of attitude. He told her with the casual ease of a man who had said it many times before that she was going to be sitting in a cell tonight, and that it would give her time to think about how she'd spoken to a sworn officer of the law. Then he said something about CPS, about what happened to children when their parent accumulated a criminal record, and he said it the way you mention the weather offhandedly, as though the threat of taking a child from a mother was simply an administrative observation, rather than the specific documented form of coercion that it was. Naomi said nothing. She was looking out the window and she was building the federal case in her mind, the way she had been trained to build cases methodically from evidence outward, not from conclusion backward. She noted no probable cause articulated at any point during the stop. Excessive and unnecessary physical force applied to a fully compliant stationary subject. Shoulder injury sustained during handcuffing. She would need that documented by an EMT tonight. Both handcuffs applied tighter than procedure required, the right one significantly tighter. which was itself a use of force issue. The CPS threat spoken on audio that was captured by the dash cam constituted documented coercion. Sims had been present for all of it and had heard all of it and had followed an unlawful order when given the opportunity to refuse one. She also noted the thing that Burrell did not know she was noting. In the inside breast pocket of her peacoat, pressed flat against her chest and entirely invisible from the outside, was her federal work identification. The card bore the seal of the United States Department of Justice. It said in raised black type, Lead Investigator, Civil Rights Division. She had left it there on purpose. She had arrived in Riverdale Heights 72 hours ago, specifically to observe how this precinct treated ordinary black people before she revealed who she was. She had wanted to see the behavior unperformed, unguarded, completely natural. She had been in plain clothes every day. She had stood at careful distances and watched Burrell make stops that had no legal basis and end without charges filed and leave behind people who were shaken and had no recourse. She had been building toward a different kind of confrontation. Documents, interviews, formal findings. She had not planned for this, but she had the card, and she had the audio, and she had Joel Sims, who had watched everything, and whose conscience she had seen in the 1 second their eyes met on the sidewalk was not yet entirely gone. The cruiser pulled into the 4th Precinct's rear lot. Burrell killed the engine, got out, opened her door, and marched her through the back entrance with the practiced ease of a man performing a routine he had performed many times before. She walked with her head up. She always did. The 4th Precinct's booking area was too bright and too grimy simultaneously. Harsh fluorescent strips overhead walls that had graduated from white to beige to a color that had no official name. A long wooden bench bolted to the wall with iron restraint rings, and behind the elevated desk, Sergeant Earl Dunbar. Dunbar was 58 years old, with 31 years on the force and 3 weeks left until retirement. He had a photograph of his grandchildren in his desk drawer and a doctor's appointment scheduled for 2 days after his last shift. He was in the way that some career officers managed to be a careful man, not a hero, not a reformer, but someone who had tried for 3 decades to do his specific job without causing unnecessary harm, and who had largely succeeded by never looking too closely at what happened around him. He was shuffling incident reports when Burrell came through with Naomi. He looked up. The room was not quiet when they walked in. 3 officers at their desks, phones ringing, a printer cycling through a stack of documents. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon noise of a working precinct. And then Dunbar took off his reading glasses, and the noise didn't stop, but it stopped mattering. He had seen her face before. 3 days ago, Captain Hartley had distributed a briefing packet during the morning meeting, a courtesy notice from the Department of Justice regarding an incoming federal audit, and then had collected the packets at the end of the meeting without explanation. Dunbar had thought that was unusual at the time. He was now understanding it with the sudden complete clarity of a man who has been living with a piece of information he didn't know was important. The woman in handcuffs crossing his booking area was the woman in the briefing packet photograph. He was absolutely certain of it. His face went the color of old concrete. He set his glasses down. His hands were not steady. Burrell was already talking, announcing his caller to the room with the particular volume of a man who wants an audience. "Hey, Sarge. Live one here. Loitering, failure to comply, resisting public disturbance. Need her processed." From the corner of the room near the back wall, Officer Rena Cole, who had filed a complaint against Burrell 14 months ago, describing a stop she had witnessed that she believed was racially motivated, a complaint that had vanished from the system within a week of her filing. It looked up from her keyboard. She had heard Burrell's voice make that announcement more times than she could count. She looked at the woman he was parading through the booking area, and something in her face changed. She set her coffee mug down. She did not pick it up again. Dunbar opened his mouth. Before he could produce a word, the door to Captain Hartley's office opened. Vince Hartley came through his office door mid-sentence, directing a detective toward a filing cabinet, the words already formed and leaving his mouth on momentum, before his eyes swept the booking area and stopped. His file hit the floor. Papers separated in the air and drifted down around his feet, and he did not look at them. He could not look at them. He was looking at the woman standing handcuffed at his booking desk, with the expression of a man who has been anticipating a particular catastrophe and has just watched it materialize in front of him in a form that is simultaneously exactly what he feared, and somehow still worse. He covered the distance at something between a walk and a run, shouldering past Burrell, hard enough that the larger man stumbled. What the Burrell started. Not one word. Hartley's voice was a sound that had never come out of him before. Gutted, hollowed out the voice of a man watching something he cannot stop. He was already reaching for Dunbar's keys, his hands shaking with a fine visible tremor. "Dr. Pierce, I am there. Are no words. Please, let me." The room went silent, not gradually. Between 1 second and the next completely. Every keyboard went still. Every phone call held. Officer Cole's hand was frozen over her mouse. The civilian near the far wall set down his form and did not move. The printer kept cycling. The printer always kept cycling. But every human being in that room had stopped whatever they were doing and understood with the collective instinct of people witnessing something historic that something irreversible was happening. Hartley fitted the key into the lock on the third try. His hands were shaking badly. He had seen her photograph in the briefing packet 3 days ago. He had shaken her hand metaphorically in his mind, in the way administrators mentally greet incoming oversight, and had prayed with the specific private desperation of a man who fears accountability that she would conduct her audit from a distance in conference rooms, in documents that she would never have reason to set foot in his precinct. He had looked the other way for 7 years. He had put 22 complaints in a drawer. He had taken the HOA's money in the form of a benevolent fund check and called it community partnership. He had done all of this, believing in the comfortable way that people believe things they need to believe, that the distance between him and consequence was permanent. The cuffs came free. Naomi brought her arms forward and stood straight. She looked at her wrists, both of them slowly cataloging the damage. The right wrist was worse. The steel had been applied well past the point of restraint, and the red indentation was already deepening toward bruise, the damaged tissue beginning its slow bloom toward something darker and more lasting. She pressed her wrists together gently, feeling the throb of it, and then she folded her hands in front of her and looked at Hartley. He was beginning to apologize. He was using the word misunderstanding and the phrase, "We can handle this quietly," and he was gesturing toward his office and suggesting water and damage control, and the particular administrative euphemism that powerful men reach for when they want to convert a crime into a conversation. Naomi let him finish. She gave him the courtesy of completing his sentence. Then she spoke into the complete silence of the booking area, in a voice that was perfectly level, and that carried to every corner without being raised. "Captain Hartley." She paused. Let the room feel the weight of what she was about to say. "A misunderstanding is writing the wrong address on a dispatch ticket. What happened on that sidewalk today has a federal name, several of them." She turned her head and looked at Burrell. He was standing exactly where Hartley had shoved him near the booking bench, a foot from where he'd intended to seat her for processing. His face had done something it had probably never done in 18 years of wearing a badge. It had lost its certainty. The hammer. The man the Union Hall had nicknamed because he crushed things. He was looking at Naomi Pierce, and his face was pale and plain, and entirely completely exposed. She had warned him. On the sidewalk, with her arm in his grip and the cold steel on her wrists, she had told him quietly that he was going to repeat every word under oath. He had laughed. The laugh had felt like power at the time. Standing here now in his own booking area, with every officer in the room frozen and watching, the laugh felt like the most expensive sound he had ever made. Hartley said her name again. Dr. Pierce. He said it the way a man says the name of something he has destroyed. If you'll just come into my office, we can. No. She said it simply and without heat. Then she turned to Dunbar. Sergeant Dunbar. All body camera footage, dash camera footage, and dispatch audio from Cruiser 409 are to be transferred to a DOJ, secured federal server immediately. Not copied locally. Transferred and confirmed within 30 minutes. If a single frame of video or a second of audio from this afternoon is missing, corrupted, or altered when my team accesses it, the charge is obstruction of a federal investigation, and it will apply to every person in this building who had access to that footage. She paused. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Dunbar's fingers were already moving. She turned to Hartley. I want an EMT here to document my injuries. Both wrists. Right shoulder. That documentation becomes the first exhibit. She looked down at her right wrist at the mark already going dark against her skin. I want the circumference of that cuff mark measured in millimeters and photographed before the bruising matures. Hartley was already reaching for his radio. He nodded in the jerking, over-eager way of a man trying to dig himself out of a hole with pure compliance and discovering the hole has no bottom. Then the glass doors opened. Dominic Pierce was 42 years old and had the stillness of a man who worked in operating theaters, where stillness was the difference between someone living and someone dying. He was in green hospital scrubs with a cardiothoracic surgery center logo on the breast pocket, and he moved through the booking area with the unhurried, purposeful stride of someone who had operated on beating hearts for 17 years and was not accustomed to rooms that didn't reorganize themselves around him. He was holding Marcus's hand. Marcus's face was a 9-year-old face, after genuine sustained terror, reddened eyes, dried tear tracks, the particular exhausted rawness of a child who has cried very hard and run out of tears, and is now simply waiting for the adult who is supposed to fix the thing to fix the thing. He saw his mother. He said "mommy" in a voice that had nothing in it except relief and ran. He crossed the booking area floor and threw himself against her waist with everything he had, the full force of a 9-year-old who has been terrified for an hour and has finally arrived at the one place in the world where terror stops. Naomi went to her knees on the precinct floor. Right there on the scuffed linoleum in front of the booking desk, and the frozen officers, and the pale captain, and the ruined hammer. She wrapped her arms around her son and pressed her face into his hair and held on. "I'm right here," she said into the top of his head. "I'm right here, sweetheart. You're safe. I'm safe. Everything is going to be okay." His shoulders shook. She kept one hand on the back of his head and breathed with him, slow, steady, deliberately slow, until his shaking eased. Dominic stopped 3 feet away. He looked at her wrists. He looked at the right wrist, specifically at the dark red indentation, already going purple at its deepest point. The muscle in his jaw set one small, precise contraction, a single tell in a face that gave away nothing else. And then he looked up, and he found Burrell, and in a voice pitched just barely above a murmur, he asked, "Who?" Not a question, a designation. Burrell opened his mouth. Nothing came. She held Marcus for a long moment. Then she rose, keeping one hand on his shoulder, and looked at her brother. "Take him home, Dom. I have work to do here. I'll be a few hours." Dominic held her gaze the way siblings hold each other's gaze when one of them is trying to communicate something that isn't being said. He looked at her wrists again. He breathed out through his nose. "You're sure? Take care of my boy." She watched Dominic guide Marcus toward the doors, watched Marcus look back over his shoulder with eyes that were still swollen, watched her raise her hand in a small, steady wave that she held until he went through the glass and was gone. Then she turned back to the room. Fully. Burrell had found his voice somewhere in the 30 seconds she'd been focused on her son. It was a smaller voice than before, rougher, thinned out by the specific anxiety of a man watching his certainties dissolve. But he was using it to construct something. He was saying she had never identified herself, that he had no way of knowing, that she had refused a lawful order, that the union would be hearing about this. Naomi walked to the booking desk and set her federal work ID on the surface face up so that every person present could see the seal and the title. She left it there. She did not pick it up. She turned to face Burrell and looked at him the way she had been looking at subjects of federal investigations for 12 years, with the complete unhurried attention of someone who has already built the case and is no longer in a hurry. The dashcam audio will confirm she said that no lawful order was ever articulated. You will not find reasonable, articulable suspicion on that footage, because none existed. What you will find is a woman standing on a public sidewalk, complying with every request that had a legal foundation, declining every request that didn't, and then being physically assaulted when her compliance wasn't sufficiently deferential. She tilted her head slightly. You put cuffs on the woman holding your audit officer, Burrell. Think about that on the drive to wherever you're going next. He had no answer. His hands moved to his belt the way they had moved 1,000 times before, reflexive reaching for the equipment that meant authority, and stopped because the equipment was not going to help him. The equipment was about to leave his body permanently. Hartley turned to face Burrell with the expression of a man who has calculated survival and made his choice. Badge and service weapon. Both of you. Sims stepped forward immediately, unbuckling without a word, setting his belt on the desk, with the quiet relief of a person who has been carrying something terrible and is finally allowed to put it down. Burrell moved slowly. He unholstered his Glock and set it on the booking desk. He unpinned his badge, 18 years of identity of the nickname of the Hammer, and placed it next to the gun. It made a flat, small sound on the laminate surface that was entirely disproportionate to what it represented. He stared at it, then looked away. Near the back wall, Officer Rena Cole, who had filed a complaint 14 months ago that had been buried in Hartley's drawer before she could track its progress, stood with her coffee mug still untouched. She looked at the badge on the desk. She looked at Naomi. She exhaled slowly through her nose, with the quiet expression of a person watching a debt that has been owed for a long time finally come due. Naomi looked at Hartley. Largest conference room. Secure internet connection. She picked up her tote bag. The audit wasn't starting next week, Captain. It started 9 minutes before Burrell hit his lights. And it just got considerably more interesting. By Wednesday morning, the preliminary audit had become something with considerably higher stakes and considerably wider walls. Naomi's Team 6 federal analysts and 2 FBI liaison agents arrived at the downtown federal building on Meridian Street at 6 a.m. and established their command center 7 floors above the city in a clean room with secure servers and no connection to the 4th Precinct's local systems. She had been explicit about why they were not working from the precinct's facilities, and she had used the word contamination, and her team had understood immediately. They pulled 5 years of 4th Precinct digital records, dispatch logs, arrest reports, use of force filings, body cam archives, internal affairs records, every pedestrian contact report filed under any officer assigned to the Riverdale Heights beat since 2019. An hour into the analysis, her senior analyst, a methodical woman named Agent Diane Foster, slid a printout across the table without comment. Naomi looked at it for 30 seconds. 340 documented pedestrian contacts in Riverdale Heights over the preceding 36 months. The volume was anomalous for a low-crime residential neighborhood by a factor of roughly 8. The demographic breakdown was not ambiguous. 91% of documented subjects were Black or Latino. 87% resulted in no charges, no citations, no evidence of any crime. They were stops legally unjustifiable, performed under no articulable suspicion, and generating no law enforcement purpose that could be written down. Wade Burrell's name appeared on 180 of them. But it was what Foster set on the table next that opened the real door. A single dispatch log printout flagged with a yellow tab. She set it down and tapped the tab without speaking. On 43 separate occasions over the preceding 14 months, Burrell's cruiser had received location coordinates from a private cell phone number, not the department's dispatch system, not any official channel minutes before each documented stop. Someone outside the department was directing him to specific people at specific locations. Naomi held the printout and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the timestamp on the first entry, 14 months ago. The scheme had been running for 14 months before she arrived. Longer, probably. This was just the documented window. Subpoena the cell number, she said. Full message history. I want it tonight. She also asked Foster to pull something else. Something that the dispatch logs and arrest records couldn't tell her, but that property records could. She had a theory. She wanted the ownership history of every property on the eastern corridor of Riverdale Heights going back 5 years. Every sale, every buyer, every price. She had a theory and she was afraid she was right. The cell number belonged to Patricia Elwood, 58 years old, 114 Birchwood Drive, Riverdale Heights, HOA president for 6 consecutive years. The woman who had stood on her porch with her arms crossed while Burrell wrenched Naomi's arm behind her back. The text message thread arrived from the federal subpoena at 9:47 p.m. Wednesday night, and Naomi read it in the war room while her analysts went quiet around her, understanding from her posture that what she was reading was significant. The thread was not subtle. Elwood had been sending Burrell photographs of people walking through Riverdale Heights, predominantly Black and Latino individuals, going about ordinary business on public streets, with attached descriptions that ranged from suspicious vehicle, doesn't belong here, to the single word stray. Burrell's responses were operational locations, confirmed arrival times, estimated occasional brief acknowledgments. The timing of each exchange aligned precisely with the timing of each documented stop in the patrol logs. The message sent at 3:03 p.m. on Tuesday was a photograph. It showed Naomi taken from a distance of approximately 40 feet from behind a porch railing, standing outside Whitmore Academy's iron gates in her navy peacoat. The message read, "Woman outside Whitmore. Been there 20 minutes. Doesn't belong here. Take care of it." Naomi looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at herself in it. Small, distant entirely, ordinary, a woman holding a cup of coffee, waiting for her son, and she thought about what it meant that someone had looked at that image and seen something that needed to be removed. She thought about the 9 minutes between the text and the cruiser. She thought about the sound of Marcus's bridge hitting the sidewalk. Then Elwood's financial records arrived. The Riverdale Heights Beautification Fund, $200,000 raised over 3 years from HOA membership fees. Disbursements that didn't correspond to any landscaping contract, lighting improvement, or public infrastructure project. The money had moved through a payment processing account connected to a property management LLC called Cornerstone Residential Group. Cornerstone Residential Group was owned by Glenn Sterling, Deputy Mayor of Harwick County. Direct administrative oversight of the 4th Precinct's annual budget. Personal approval on Captain Hartley's last 2 performance evaluations. Foster set the property ownership records on the table at midnight. Naomi opened them and began reading, and as she read, the shape of what she had suspected became real and specific, and far worse than she had wanted to be right about. The eastern corridor of Riverdale Heights, 6 blocks of older, well-built homes that bordered the adjacent mixed-income neighborhood, had experienced an extraordinary rate of ownership change over the preceding 4 years. 11 properties had changed hands. In every case, the sellers were families who had owned their homes for between 8 and 35 years. In every case, the sale price was between 28 and 42% below the current assessed market value. In every case, Cornerstone Residential Group, or one of its affiliated entities, had appeared as the buyer within months of the sale or the ultimate acquirer after a brief intermediate transaction. The properties were then held for between 12 and 24 months and resold. The average profit per property was $312,000. Total proceeds from the scheme in excess of $3.4 million. Naomi read the file to the end. The last entry was a man named Charles Boyden, 64 years old, black, retired postal worker and veteran. He and his late wife had purchased the house at 41 Hawthorne Circle 31 years ago. He had filed 3 police complaints in 4 months, all received, all buried in Hartley's drawer, all unprocessed and unacknowledged. He had been stopped and questioned by Burrell 6 times while walking in his own neighborhood. He had been cited twice for infractions that other residents on the same block had never been cited for. He had sold his house in October of the preceding year, $280,000 below assessed value, because his daughter had told investigators in a statement attached to the property record he could no longer walk to the corner store without his heart hammering in his chest, and he could no longer sleep. And he had told her he was too old and too tired to keep fighting something he couldn't see the whole shape of. 8 months after the sale, Charles Boyden had suffered a fatal cardiac event. He was 64 years old. He had owned that house for 31 years. Naomi read the file. She stood behind the table in the war room with 11 property records in front of her and the midnight city visible through the windows, and she said nothing for a full minute. The analysts were quiet. Foster did not interrupt. Then Naomi said, "When the arrests are complete, the first call we make is to Charles Boyden's daughter. The DOJ will be issuing a formal written acknowledgement of what happened to her father. I want it in the sentencing record." She paused. "It won't be enough. We do it anyway." She looked at Foster. "Draft federal arrest warrants for Burrell, Hartley, Elwood, and Sterling. I want them executed at 5 a.m. Saturday. Charges conspiracy against civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, bribery of a public official, wire fraud, and RICO predicate acts." She picked up her pen. "And I want the Eastern Corridor families identified in the restitution structure before we file." Thursday night past 11. The war room quieter now. The city dark outside the windows. Foster at one end of the table, and Naomi at the other with the property records spread between them. A junior agent knocked on the glass partition. "Dr. Pierce, there's someone in the lobby. Officer Joel Sims. He has private counsel. He's asking for a meeting and requesting federal immunity in exchange for full cooperation." Naomi set down her pen. She looked at the property records for another moment. Then, "Bring them up." Sims looked like a man who had not slept since Tuesday, because he had not slept since Tuesday. He sat across from Naomi with his attorney, a compact woman named Carol Marsh, and he folded his hands on the table and looked at Naomi with the specific, exhausted honesty of a person who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally decided that the cost of carrying it is higher than the cost of setting it down. He started talking before she asked a question. "I should have stopped him on the sidewalk," he said. His voice was low and uneven at the edges. "I knew it was wrong from the moment he slowed the cruiser. I've known it was wrong for months. He's done this dozens of times, and I've sat in that passenger seat and said nothing, because he's ruined rookies who pushed back against him, altered their evaluations, tanked their probationary reports. 2 officers left the department rather than deal with him. He told me the first week that his word was the only word that mattered on the Riverdale beat." He swallowed. "I believed him. Apologies don't change evidence records." "Mr. Sims," Naomi said, "what are you offering?" His attorney opened the folder on the table. Inside were printed screenshots from an encrypted messaging platform. The Elwood Burrell thread that Naomi already had, but alongside them were bank deposit slips, physical paper documenting cash deposits into a personal account in Burrell's name, in amounts that aligned precisely with the Beautification Fund disbursements on 16 dates over 14 months. And a photograph. It was slightly blurry from distance, taken covertly on a phone. But it was clear enough. Burrell in the Whitmore Academy parking lot, 40 yards from where he had arrested Naomi, accepting a sealed white envelope from Patricia Elwood. Timestamp of Friday, 4 months ago, 4:23 p.m. I took it, Sims said. I didn't know what to do with it. I kept it for 4 months, telling myself I was waiting for the right moment. He looked at the photograph. There's no right moment. I know that now. Captain Hartley, Naomi said. Sims nodded. He knew the arrangement existed. He didn't take cash directly. But the HOA's annual donation to the Benevolent Fund covered the precinct's community policing budget for 2 consecutive years. Hartley understood that if Burrell's operation stopped, the donation stopped. He chose his budget. Naomi looked at the photograph for a long moment. Your immunity agreement depends on the completeness of your testimony. If you withhold a single detail that we subsequently find through other means, the agreement is void. Do you understand that? Yes. Go home. Get some sleep. You'll hear from us before dawn. Elwood began talking at 6:47 a.m. Saturday morning, 40 minutes after her arrest, before her high-priced attorney had finished buttoning his coat in the parking lot. The federal penitentiary sentence her interrogating agent had outlined was more than she could absorb, and the gap between the life she had lived in Riverdale Heights, the espresso machine, the silk robe, the HOA gavel, and the life being described to her in that cold interview room was so enormous and so suddenly real that she filled it the only way left available to her. She confirmed the arrangement. She confirmed the cash payments. She confirmed 14 months of text messages directing Burrell toward specific people she had deemed aesthetically inappropriate for the neighborhood. She said all of this with the residual confidence of a woman who still on some fundamental level believed she was describing a community management program rather than a federal conspiracy. Then she said something that made the interrogating agent stop writing. She said Glenn was the one who suggested the structure. Naomi, watching from behind the two-way mirror with Foster beside her, leaned forward very slightly. Sterling had come to Elwood 3 years ago with what he called an opportunity. The eastern corridor of Riverdale Heights had been identified by his development interests as a high-value redevelopment zone. The homes were well-built, well-located, and owned by families who had lived there for years, decades in some cases. They were not going to sell at market rate under ordinary pressure. They were not economically displaceable. But they were, Sterling had calculated, with the specific coldness of someone who had spent years studying how people break potentially displaceable by something more deliberate. A sustained, coordinated campaign of police harassment, hostile neighbor pressure, false citations. The slow, grinding psychological weight of being made to feel that the law was not your ally, and that your presence was being actively contested by the very institutions that were supposed to protect you. 11 families in 4 years. Properties acquired at 30 to 40% below market value. $3.4 million in illegal proceeds. And one man who had owned his home for 31 years, who had been stopped 6 times by a police officer while walking in his own neighborhood, who had sold below value because he was too exhausted to keep fighting something he couldn't fully see, and who had died 8 months after he lost the home he had given his life to owning. Naomi stood behind the glass and thought about Charles Boyden's daughter growing up in that house on Hawthorne Circle. She thought about what it cost to build 31 years of life in a place and then be pushed out of it by people who had decided you didn't belong there before they'd ever learned your name. She breathed. Then she turned to Foster. Expand the RICO indictment to include Sterling's full development network. And I want Boyden's daughter's attorney on the phone before we file. Patricia Elwood was awake before they arrived. She was in her kitchen at 5:17 a.m. Saturday, in a rose silk robe sitting at the marble island, with an espresso macchiato, drafting a neighborhood watch post on her tablet, defending Burrell's suspension as a politically motivated injustice against a dedicated public servant. She was on her fourth revision of the word injustice when the front door came in. The sound was total and immediate. A concussive breach that moved through the house's structure and hit Elwood's chest and knocked her espresso cup off the island before she'd processed what had happened. It shattered against the marble, and the hot liquid spread across her perfect floor, and she was on her feet screaming, reaching for the familiar things: her phone, her sense of order, the certainty that she was a woman, insulated by wealth from the consequences of what she did with it. When the first agent came through the foyer, FBI, federal agents, search warrant, hands where we can see them. Agent Foster moved through the kitchen with the paperwork open in her hand. She reached the island, set the warrant down in the middle of the spreading espresso, and looked at Elwood. Patricia Elwood, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, bribery of a public official, and federal wire fraud. Her voice was entirely unperturbed. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Do you have any idea who I am? Elwood's voice was high and fracturing. I am the president of this HOA. My husband is a senior partner at Harrison & Webb. I will have every single one of your turnaround. 2 agents moved from either side. The transition took 4 seconds. The handcuffs closed around Patricia Elwood's wrists, around the wrists of the woman who had sent a photograph of a mother waiting for her child, and typed the words, "Doesn't belong here." And she felt the steel and gasped and began to cry, because the bubble had finally broken, and what was underneath it was just a woman in a silk robe in a broken kitchen with her espresso on the floor, being walked to a federal transport vehicle, while her neighbors watched from their porches in pajamas and understood slowly and uncomfortably something about the things they had participated in by not asking questions. Across town, Burrell opened his apartment door himself. He had been awake for most of 3 days. He raised his hands before the lead agent finished identifying the unit. He looked without his uniform and his belt and his badge and his nickname, like a man who was just a man, soft and tired and smaller than anyone who had watched him work would have believed. He wept during processing, not from remorse, from the specific grief of someone who believed they were untouchable and has discovered too late and all at once that they were not. 6:03 a.m. Both shifts present. Maximum witness count. Naomi entered the 4th precinct in a charcoal suit, with her right wrist still in the medical brace. The bruising, fully documented, photographed, measured in millimeters, entered as Exhibit A, flanked by Foster and 2 federal marshals, 4 more agents behind them. She walked through the front doors, and the lobby registered their entrance the way a body registers a sudden temperature drop. The desk sergeant looked up. His face moved through surprise, recognition, dread. Hartley came out of his office and stopped when he saw her. He walked toward her and stopped again, and for a moment, the 2 of them simply regarded each other. The captain who had filed complaints in a drawer for 7 years, and the investigator who had spent 72 hours building the case that would end him, and the distance between them was only 12 feet, but felt immeasurably larger than that. Naomi's voice carries to every corner of the booking area without being raised. Captain Hartley, the 4th precinct is under federal receivership effective as of this moment. All operational authority transfers to a federally appointed monitor. You are relieved of command. She nodded to Agent Reed. He stepped forward with the warrant. Hartley did not resist. He did not argue. He placed his hands behind his back when asked, and the cuffs closed, and he was walked across the booking area of his own precinct, past Dunbar's desk, past the officers at their keyboards, past the bench, where he had allowed his officers to parade citizens for years, and through the glass doors, and into the morning light. 60 officers watched. Not one of them moved to stop it. Several of them looked at the floor. Near the back wall, Officer Rena Cole, who had filed a complaint against Burrell 14 months ago and had watched it disappear, looked at Naomi across the room. Naomi held her gaze for a moment and gave her a single brief nod. The kind of nod that said, "I know. It's in the record. It counts now." Cole picked up her coffee mug and finally took a sip. United States versus Burrell, Elwood, Sterling, and Hartley became a national story within 48 hours and remained one for the full duration. Naomi recused herself from the prosecution team. She drove to court every morning and sat in the front row of the gallery in a charcoal suit, her right wrist brace visible, and she was there when the doors opened and there when they closed. Her presence was not theatrical. It was a fact, a daily, unavoidable, completely silent fact that every person in that courtroom processed in their own way and that no one was able to entirely ignore. Joel Sims testified on day 3. He had been prepared by the prosecution, but what he brought to the witness stand was not polish. It was the plain account of a young officer who had watched something wrong happen many times and had not stopped it, and was now in the only remaining way available to him, trying to stop it. He said, with his eyes scanning the jury, "Burrell told me we were managing the neighborhood profile. He said it like it was part of the job description, like it was a task on a shift checklist. He described the Elwood texts. He described the cash envelope system. He described Hartley's selective institutional blindness and the specific way the HOA donation and the buried complaints connected to form a single coherent machine. He looked at Elwood when he testified about her messages, the photographs, the descriptions, the word stray, applied to human beings walking on public streets, and Elwood shrank in her chair in the particular way of a person who has never once imagined that anyone outside her immediate circle would hear the things she says in private." Then Crane introduced Exhibit A. The screens were large enough for every person in the gallery to see without leaning. The footage was unedited, and the audio was fully intact. The jury watched Naomi standing at the sidewalk with her thermos patient still composed, asking questions that had legal answers and declining requests that had no legal basis. They watched Burrell's escalation. They watched the grab. They watched the thermos fall. And then they heard Marcus. The sound of a 9-year-old's voice saying, "Mom." That specific terrified searching call that contains the full weight of a child's trust in a parent moved through the courtroom speakers and settled somewhere behind every sternum in the room before anyone had consciously processed it. 2 jurors wept. The jury foreman, a retired veteran in his 60s, who had watched the proceedings with careful, measured attention, turned his gaze to the defense table and held it there with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was the settled, permanent form of contempt that wraps itself around a thing and does not release it. Naomi sat in the front row and did not close her eyes. She had promised herself in the car on the way to court that morning that she would not react. She was almost right. Her posture did not change. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her face held the composed, quiet steadiness that 12 years of federal civil rights work had carved into it. But somewhere behind her sternum, when Marcus's voice came through those speakers, when the court recorder's machine preserved forever, the sound of her son calling for her from a public sidewalk with handcuffs on his mother's wrists, something closed like a fist and did not open again for a very long time. She held her injured wrist in her other hand, and she looked at the screen, and she let every juror see what it cost her to sit still in that chair and do it anyway. The defense spent 3 days trying to introduce complexity into something that was not complex. They tried to frame Sims as an opportunist, Elwood's texts as the overenthusiasm of a concerned resident, Burrell's conduct as the reasonable exercise of discretion under challenging conditions. The jury had watched the footage. The jury had heard Marcus's voice. The jury had read the property records that detailed 11 families displaced by a criminal enterprise and one 64-year-old veteran who had died 8 months after losing the home he'd spent 31 years building. Deliberations, 3 hours, 51 minutes. Guilty on all counts for Burrell. Guilty on all RICO charges for Elwood and Sterling. Hartley had pleaded guilty pretrial in exchange for cooperation. Judge Raymond Cole was 61 years old and had been on the federal bench for 23 years. He was not a man who performed gravity. He possessed the specific settled weight of someone who has spent 2 decades saying true things in rooms where truth is supposed to carry consequence, and who has never stopped believing that it does. He said Burrell's name first into the complete silence of the courtroom. Wade Burrell. He let the name sit in the room for a moment before he continued. You were given a sworn oath and a public badge and 18 years of public trust. You decided the oath was optional. The badge was property, and the trust was a resource to be monetized. He paused. You dragged a federal investigator off a public sidewalk in front of her 9-year-old son. The boy dropped the bridge model he had spent 3 weeks building. It broke on the pavement. You laughed. You drove away. That is the sum total of what you used 18 years of law enforcement authority to be, and this court will not allow you to minimize it. He picked up his pen. 14 years in a federal correctional institution. No possibility of early parole. Permanent revocation of law enforcement certification and municipal pension. You are remanded to federal custody immediately. The gavel. The sound of it was final in the specific way that certain sounds are final. Not because they are loud, but because they close something that does not open again. Elwood's sentencing under the federal RICO statutes, the Riverdale Heights estate was seized. Her vehicles, confiscated, her bank accounts permanently forfeited as proceeds of a criminal enterprise. 9 years federal. She left the courtroom in a borrowed court suit, her espresso machine and silk robe, and 6 years of HOA authority permanently behind her. Sterling, 11 years, and permanent disbarment from public office. The 11 displaced families were named in the sentencing record as primary restitution beneficiaries, funded from the seized assets of Sterling's LLC network. And Charles Boyden's daughter received a formal written acknowledgement from the United States Department of Justice, requested specifically by the lead investigator and approved by the department's senior counsel, that her father's home had been taken from him through a federally prosecuted criminal enterprise, that his 3 complaints had been filed and buried deliberately, that his suffering had been real and documented and was now permanently part of the official record of the United States government. It was not enough. Nothing would be enough for what had been taken from Charles Boyden in the last years of his life. But it was what the law could offer, and Naomi had made sure it was offered completely. When the marshals came for Burrell, they moved through the gallery aisle, and Burrell, already standing, already understanding that the motion had begun, paused and turned his head and looked at the front row for the last time. Naomi looked back at him. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her posture straight, and she gave him the full, clear weight of her gaze, not triumphant, not angry, not performing anything at all, just looking at him the way she had looked at him on the sidewalk, with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had understood exactly what was happening from the first moment and had simply waited for it to resolve itself. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then the marshals turned him and walked him through the courtroom door, and he was gone. Naomi unfolded her hands. She looked at her right wrist. The bruising gone now, the skin clear and unmarked, the wrist itself perfectly functional. She sat with the absence of the mark for a moment. Then she stood, collected her jacket, and walked out of the courtroom in the direction of the work still waiting to be done. 6 months later, the autumn came back. The elms dropped their leaves on schedule across Riverdale Heights, coating the sidewalks in gold and rust, and the air had the same clean chill it always carried in October pine and chimney smoke, and the particular clarity of a season that strips things down to what they actually are. The Riverdale Heights Homeowners Association had been dissolved under a federal consent decree issued 3 weeks after sentencing its board replaced by a state-appointed oversight committee. 3 of the committee's 7 seats were held by residents of the Eastern Corridor people whose right to live on their own streets had been contested by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The 4th Precinct was in its first year of an 18-month federal monitorship. Mandatory body camera compliance, Civilian Complaint Review. Under independent oversight. Quarterly, DOJ reporting zero tolerance for undocumented pedestrian contacts. Officer Rena Cole had been promoted to sergeant. Joel Sims had been transferred to a different district, placed on supervised probation, and attended a community accountability workshop every month. He was not a hero. He was a person who had chosen too late and at significant personal cost to do the right thing, and who understood that the choosing came with a long, ongoing bill. On a Tuesday afternoon in October at 3:22 p.m., Naomi Pierce was sitting on the public sidewalk bench outside Whitmore Academy in her navy peacoat with a thermos of coffee. The bench was the same bench. The iron gates were the same. The elm trees were the same. No cruiser slowed as it passed. No spotlight found her. No hand tightened on the grip of a belt. She was a woman on a public sidewalk, and the afternoon acknowledged her and moved on. She thought sitting there about Charles Boyden. She thought about him walking to the corner store from 41 Hawthorne Circle on 31 years of mornings, and about his daughter growing up in the house, and about what it cost to build a life in a place and have it taken from you by people who decided before they knew your name that you didn't belong there. She thought about his daughter receiving the DOJ's letter, and whether it had meant anything, and whether meaning anything was the same as being enough. She sat with that question, the way she sat with most of the hard questions her work produced, not to resolve it, because it couldn't be resolved, but because refusing to sit with it would mean something worse. At 3:30 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the academy swung open, and the children came streaming down the steps in their green blazers, and among them, his blazer fitting properly, now his navy backpack over one shoulder, and both arms extended with something carried carefully in front of him, was Marcus Pierce. He was taller than he had been in October. He had his mother's eyes and his own particular gravity, and he came down the steps at a run and stopped in front of her and held up what he was carrying with the complete unguarded joy of a child who has built something that works. It was a suspension bridge. New materials, better cable tension. The anchor points positioned at the angle he had finally figured out after 3 more weeks of work and 2 more failed prototypes. The deck sat level. The cables ran true. The whole structure held itself with the quiet, elegant assurance of a thing built by someone who understood now the principles underneath it well enough to apply them correctly. "Mom, look." His voice was the voice of a boy who is 9 years old and has made something good and wants his mother to see it more than he wants anything else in the entire world. Watch the cables. They hold the whole load. It actually works. It finally actually works. Naomi stood up. She looked at the bridge. She looked at the cables, the deck, the anchor points. She looked at her son's face, open and bright and lit from the inside with the specific satisfaction of a child who has solved something hard and knows it. The smile that crossed her face belonged entirely to her. Not composed, not calibrated, not measured against what the room required. Full and fierce and radiant, the smile of a woman who has paid a real price for standing on a public sidewalk and has received in this exact moment the only payment that has ever actually mattered to her. She wrapped both arms around him. He held the bridge carefully to one side and leaned into her anyway, because the bridge was important, but his mother was more important, and at 9 years old, he still knew the order of things. "It's perfect," she said into the top of his head. "I want to build real ones someday," he said into her peacoat. "Actual ones that cross actual rivers." "You will," she said. And she meant it the way she meant everything completely without reservation, with the full weight of someone who has learned the difference between a promise and a fact, and makes only the latter. They walked to the Nissan together in the low amber light of late October. Marcus explaining load distribution and the mathematics of tension. Naomi listening the way she always listened to him, like it was the first time, and also the only thing in the world worth hearing. The elm trees dropped their leaves on schedule. The sidewalks were clean. The afternoon was quiet, in the way that good things are quiet, not empty, not absent, but full of exactly what it should contain. A woman and her son walking on a public sidewalk in the golden, ordinary, unremarkable light of an October afternoon going home. If you made it to the end of this story, if the justice landing hit you the way it's supposed to hit, subscribe to our channel. We put out stories like this every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Naomi's position in the back of that police car with the badge in your pocket? We read every one. See you in the next story.